"Can you pretend to be my boyfriend for a day?" she asked the mechanic, not knowing he was a CEO, millionaire. The morning at Bloom and Vine was already a blur of color and motion. The scent of roses, daisies, and lilies drifted out the open front door as Nancy Monroe tied a satin ribbon around a bouquet, her fingers moving quickly but precisely. Her blonde hair was swept up in a loose twist, wisps escaping around her face. It was wedding season, meaning every customer had a deadline, a story, and a preference for eucalyptus. "Miss Nancy," a teenage assistant called from the back room. "The delivery van won't start again." Nancy winced. "Tell them to hold the peonies. I'll check it after this." Before she could move, the door swung open with a soft chime. A man stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a worn mechanic's jacket and boots dusted with dried mud. His hands were clean but calloused, his jawline shadowed by a few hours of stubble. He looked like he belonged more in a garage than a flower shop. He looked like he had never once arranged a boutonniere. James Cole walked toward the counter, adjusting the strap of his tool bag. "You called about a delivery truck?" Nancy nodded. "Out back. It keeps stalling." She gestured with a nod of her head, hands still occupied with a bouquet. James nodded and walked through the shop toward the garage entrance. His steps were quiet but confident, as if he belonged in this delicate world of petals and pastels, despite his oil-stained shirt. Rosie trailed after him with the kind of unfiltered curiosity only a child could get away with. "Are you a real mechanic?" she asked. "Some days," James said with a small smile. "Other days I pretend to be one." Nancy watched the exchange, warmth prickling her chest. Rosie had always been like this, blunt, observant, unexpectedly wise. She was Nancy's niece, biologically. But ever since Nancy's older sister passed away during childbirth, Rosie had been hers in every way that mattered. Rosie called her Mommy not because Nancy ever asked her to, but because no one else had ever stood in that role. This morning had already been stressful. Nancy had been dreading today for weeks. It was the wedding of her ex-boyfriend, and everyone expected her to show up looking unbothered, maybe even happy. Her friends, her co-workers, even the florist who sent her the invitation wrote, "Hope to see you there. With someone special?" But there was no one, just her and Rosie, and the quiet dignity of surviving heartbreak without fanfare. As James returned inside, wiping his hands on a cloth, Nancy was trying to think of an excuse to skip the wedding entirely. Rosie, however, had different plans. She stood near the register, watching James with those big, curious eyes of hers, then turned to the customer nearby and declared, "Mommy doesn't have a boyfriend, but maybe he can be." The room froze. Nancy nearly dropped the bouquet she was holding. Her face flushed. The customer chuckled. One of the other florists giggled into her coffee. "Rosie," Nancy hissed under her breath. The little girl just tilted her head. "He looks nice. And he fixed our truck." James arched a brow. "Is that a job offer or a proposal?" Nancy groaned, then met his eyes. There was something calm in his expression, not mocking or smug, just curious. She blurted before she could think, "Can you pretend to be my boyfriend for a day?" Silence again. "And then?" James looked at Rosie, then back at Nancy. "Just for one day, right?" "Yes, just one day." He nodded slowly, tucking the grease rag into his back pocket. "All right. When's the wedding?" Nancy blinked. "Today, 3 o'clock. He glanced down at his shirt. "I'll clean up." A decision made in a small flower shop under the soft scent of lavender and lavender lies. But in Nancy's chest, something stirred, a flutter of disbelief, or maybe hope. "And Rosie?" she clapped. "See? Told you he looked nice." The lakeside resort gleamed under the late afternoon sun. Laughter echoed over the water, string lights twinkled above manicured hedges, and a live band played a jazzy cover of a pop song. Champagne flowed, Heels clicked against stone pathways, and every guest looked as if they had stepped off the cover of a lifestyle magazine. Nancy Monroe stepped out of the car in a pale blue dress that hugged her gently and flared at the hem. She smoothed her skirt and reached back to help Rosie out of the car. The little girl wore her favorite pink dress with a tiny flower crown on her head, bouncing on her toes with excitement. James stepped around from the driver's side, dressed simply. A crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled, dark slacks, and shoes that had seen better days. He didn't look like he belonged, but he looked steady, and to Nancy, that was enough. "This way," she whispered, looping her arm into his. "Just smile, and act like you're used to hors d'oeuvres that cost $30. Should I ask about the caviar, or comment on the floral arrangements?" James replied under his breath, lips twitching. Nancy stifled a laugh. Inside the venue, chandeliers glittered, and waitstaff in black boaties floated past with silver trays. Nancy greeted guests, introducing James as someone she knew from the garage near her flower shop. Some nodded politely, others raised brows at his calloused hands and worn shoes. A few smirked behind flutes of champagne. James didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did, but didn't care. He knelt to tie Rosie's shoelace when it came undone. When a waitress stumbled nearby, he caught the tray before it crashed, handing it back with a quiet, "You okay?" And when a gust of wind swept through the open patio, he placed Nancy's shawl over her bare shoulders without a word. She turned to look at him, a thank you caught in her throat, but he was already scanning the crowd with calm detachment. Then came the moment Nancy had feared. They passed a group of women she hadn't seen in years. At the center stood Melissa, the woman her ex-fiancé had left her for, and now, his bride. Nancy caught the smirk before Melissa spoke. "Oh, Nancy," Melissa said sweetly, "love the dress, very modest." Her eyes flicked to James. "And this must be your date?" "James," Nancy replied, voice even. "He's a friend. From work." "Ah," Melissa said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "From the garage. Of course." Nancy moved to step away, but Melissa shifted suddenly, just enough for her wine glass to accidentally tip forward. A splash of deep red spilled across the pale blue fabric of Nancy's dress. "Oh no," Melissa gasped, one hand over her mouth. Nancy froze. The cold seeped into her skin, but it wasn't enough to numb the heat of humiliation rising in her chest. She turned slightly, trying to blot the stain, when someone behind her gave her a little nudge. Not hard, not rough, but enough. She slipped. The world tilted, and then she was in the water. Gasps rang out around the patio. Some guests screamed, others laughed. A phone screen lit up, recording. But before anyone else could move, James was already gone from her side. He dropped a full glass of wine onto the table beside him without care, tossed his phone onto a nearby chair, and sprinted to the edge. Without removing his shirt or shoes, he dove. Nancy surfaced, gasping, her dress dragging her down like an anchor, her hands flailed. She was cold, panicked, confused, until strong arms wrapped around her, pulling her upward, holding her steady. James lifted her carefully, guiding her to the edge of the pool. A silence fell over the crowd as he helped her out, gently wrapping her shawl back around her shoulders. He didn't say a word. But when Melissa tried to speak, something fake, something sugary, James turned to her, voice low, eyes sharp. "Some people don't fall because they're clumsy," he said. "They fall because others push too quietly." Melissa's smirk vanished. Nancy's teeth chattered, her dress clinging to her frame, but the tears in her eyes weren't from the water. They were from something else, something deeper. James walked over, picked Rosie up from the edge of the crowd, and carried her to Nancy. He placed the girl gently into her arms. "You okay?" he asked. Nancy nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "You didn't have to jump." James met her eyes, voice just as soft. "You didn't deserve to fall." The drive back was quiet. Rain had started to mist the windshield, soft and steady, as James guided the truck through dimly lit streets. In the back seat, Rosie slept soundly, curled against the door, her little fingers still clutching the silk handkerchief she had taken from James's pocket after the chaos of the wedding. Nancy sat in the passenger seat, her dress slightly damp, her heels kicked off. Her hair had dried into soft waves, and she leaned her head gently against the window. "Why did you agree to this?" she asked, her voice barely louder than the soft hum of the tires on the road. James didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the road. Then, after a moment, he replied, "Because you asked, and you didn't ask for much." Nancy looked over at him. His profile was calm, but tired in a way that didn't come from physical exhaustion. It was a different kind of tired, the kind that comes from being seen too little and misunderstood too often. The rest of the ride passed in silence. When they arrived at Nancy's apartment, James stepped out first and carefully unbuckled Rosie without waking her. He cradled her gently in his arms as Nancy opened the door. Inside, the apartment was warm and small, filled with soft colors and the scent of lavender. Drawings were taped neatly along the hallway. Rosie's art, stick figures with wide smiles, a house with a crooked roof, a cat with 3 eyes. James smiled. "Sorry for the mess," Nancy said, slipping off her coat. "It's usually cleaner." Rosie had an art day. James shook his head. "It's lived in. That's a good thing." As he lowered Rosie onto the couch and covered her with a soft pink blanket, he noticed a framed photo on the shelf. Nancy, in scrubs, arms around a woman who looked almost like her sister, maybe. He looked back at Nancy. "You were a nurse?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I was studying to be one, got halfway through. Then my sister passed. Rosie was only 2. There was no one else to take her." "So, you chose her," James said. "I did." He didn't respond right away, just stood there, eyes on the little girl breathing softly under the blanket. "You saved more than I did today," he said, his voice low. Nancy opened her mouth, then closed it. Gratitude sat behind her ribs, thick and unsaid. James walked to the door, reaching for the handle. "I should go." As he pulled it open, he heard the patter of small feet behind him. Rosie, still half asleep, had slipped off the couch and was now hugging his leg tightly, face pressed against the denim of his jeans. "Can he come again, Mommy?" she mumbled, eyes barely open. "He didn't laugh when you were in the water." Nancy's cheeks flushed. James crouched down, steadying himself with one hand on the doorframe. He brushed a gentle hand over Rosie's head, pushing back a few strands of blonde hair. "Only if she lets me," he said softly, looking up at Nancy. She didn't speak, just watched him, this quiet man who had stepped into her chaos, not for attention, not for heroics, but simply because she had asked. James stood, gave Rosie a wink, and stepped out into the night. This time, the silence he left behind wasn't empty. It was full of something neither of them could name yet, but both of them felt. It was a Tuesday morning when James appeared again. Nancy had just opened the flower shop, the scent of fresh lilies and eucalyptus still lingering in the cool air. She was trimming the ends of a bouquet when she heard the soft jingle of the bell over the door. "Good morning," came a familiar voice. She turned, and there he was, standing in the doorway, sleeves rolled up, a modest toolbox in hand. She blinked. "James?" He gave her a slight smile, then held up the toolbox. "I heard you've got a rebellious faucet." Nancy blinked again, surprised he remembered. A week ago, while chatting idly after dropping off Rosie's forgotten lunch, she had mentioned how the old faucet near the front counter kept dripping, a tiny detail in a sea of more important things. "You brought tools?" "I bring solutions," he said with a playful tilt of his brow. Nancy chuckled softly, still a little taken aback. "You sure you want to play plumber today?" James looked around the shop, then shrugged. "I'm already overdressed for it." Rosie, who had been coloring behind the counter, popped her head up, eyes lighting up. James. She ran over, pink dress fluttering, and clung to his leg. I missed your toolbox, she declared. He grinned down at her. Well, I missed my flashlight assistant. Want to help? Can I hold the light? You're hired. They got to work immediately. Nancy watched from behind the counter, pretending to reorganize ribbon spools, though she found herself smiling more than sorting. Rosie took her job very seriously, shining the flashlight right where James pointed. When he finally turned the valve, and the dripping stopped with a satisfying click, Rosie let out a cheer. You fixed it, Mommy. He's a real fixer. Nancy laughed, hand to her mouth. Yes, he is. James wiped his hands on a rag, then turned to Nancy. No more midnight drip symphonies. You have no idea how much I owe you, she said. He waved a hand. Lunch would settle the debt. They ended up sitting outside the shop on the curb, legs stretched out, sharing sandwiches from a street vendor and sipping orange juice in plastic cups. It felt normal, easy, like something that had happened a dozen times before, even though it hadn't. Rosie picked the crusts off her sandwich, James helped her tie her shoelaces, and Nancy just watched. Not guarded, not wary, just watching, like someone who hadn't realized how quiet her days had become until someone filled them. So, Nancy asked, peeling back the paper on her sandwich, did you always want to fix things? James took a sip of juice before answering. My dad was a mechanic, not the fancy kind. Just a guy with a shed on the side of the road and more oil stains than money. He raised me under hoods and engines. Said if you can fix something broken, you're never useless. Nancy was quiet for a moment. Sounds like he raised a good man. James looked down, thumbs pressing into the side of his cup. He tried. I got a little lost along the way. Lost how? He shrugged, eyes still lowered. Money changes things, people, and not always for the better. She didn't push. She didn't need to. Instead, she said softly, people think only money saves people. But sometimes, presence does. James looked at her, really looked, and for a long second, he didn't speak. Then, slowly, he smiled. A real one. Not the polite kind he'd worn at the wedding. Not the tight-lipped kind he used when trying not to stand out, but a warm, genuine smile, the kind a man wears when something inside finally exhales. And in that quiet moment, sitting on the edge of a sidewalk with sandwich wrappers and juice cups between them, something unspoken passed between them. Not a promise, not a confession, just presence. There was no plan for it, no set schedule, no official agreement. But James started showing up more often. Sometimes, it was a morning visit to the flower shop with coffee in hand. Other times, it was a knock on the back door of Nancy's apartment, offering to check the hinges that squeaked every time the wind blew too hard. And Rosie? Rosie had made up her mind. He was part of the team. One afternoon, James invited them to his garage, not the upscale showroom most people knew, but the smaller one tucked behind an old diner, where he kept the first car he ever fixed with his dad. Rosie followed him around like a duckling, her pink dress now paired with tiny boots Nancy had dug out for the occasion. Okay, flashlight boss, James said, handing her a tire gauge. Let's talk tire pressure. Nancy watched as he knelt beside the car, guiding Rosie's small hands to the valve. She giggled every time the hiss of air came out. You're teaching her actual things, Nancy said, a little surprised. Kids should know more than just cartoons and crayons, James replied, wiping his hands on a rag. Plus, she listens better than most adults. Later, while Rosie napped in a hammock strung between two support beams, Nancy and James stood in a shady corner of the garage. There, against the concrete wall, was a barren planter box. James stared at it like it had asked him a question. I was thinking of putting something here, he said. Nancy tilted her head. You? A garden? I know. Shocking. What kind of plant? James shrugged. Something low maintenance. I don't exactly have a green thumb. Nancy smiled. I'll help you pick. That weekend, they went to the local nursery. James walked the aisles like he was in foreign territory. Nancy pointed out hardy ferns and lavender. In the end, they chose a small lemon tree. It needs sun, Nancy said, reading the tag. And a little patience. James looked at the thin sapling, then at her. We'll see how that goes. The days bled into each other like watercolors, soft, undefined, but warm. They started grabbing lunch together, not intentionally, just naturally. Sandwiches, diner fries, orange sodas. It became less about the food and more about the pause it offered them in the middle of their messy days. And then came the ice cream evening. The sun had just started to dip, casting long shadows over the neighborhood park. The three of them sat on a wooden bench, Rosie between them, smearing vanilla on her cheeks. I made something, she announced, pulling a folded sheet of paper from her little backpack. It was a drawing, scribbled in bold crayon strokes. A car with flags on the back, 3 stick figures inside, one with long yellow hair, one with a black baseball cap, one in a pink dress. On top of the drawing, in Rosie's best 5-year-old handwriting, were the words, Team Us. Nancy's throat tightened. James didn't say anything at first. He just stared at the drawing, his hand slowly tightening around the wooden spoon of his ice cream cup. Finally, he said, voice low, more to himself than to anyone else. This started as pretend, but I've never felt more real. Nancy didn't respond. Words didn't feel necessary. Instead, she reached for his hand and held it, not dramatically, not for show, just enough that he knew she'd heard him. Rosie leaned over a moment later, nestled into Nancy's lap, her eyes heavy. And there they stayed, as the sky turned gold and the world slowed down, a team of 3 who had never planned to become one. The headline was impossible to miss. It appeared on Nancy's phone screen before she even stepped into the flower shop that morning, shared by a customer, then another, and then someone slid a printed copy under the store's front door like a cruel joke. Millionaire garage chain owner dating single mom waitress? The photo beneath the headline was blurry but unmistakable. James, in his usual work shirt, standing beside Nancy outside the shop, one hand lightly on Rosie's pink-clad shoulder. Rosie was mid-laugh. Nancy was mid-step. It looked intimate, real, which made the caption feel worse. Nancy stared at it, unmoving. Not because James was a millionaire, but because he had never said he was. And now the world knew, before she did. Inside the article, the details read like a resume she hadn't asked for. CEO of Cole Automotive Group, inherited the business, expanded it into a national brand, net worth estimates in the 8 figures. Words like mogul and heir floated between the lines like poison. They called her the mystery blonde and mentioned the flower shop, humble but charming, and Rosie, a possible daughter or relative. Nancy wanted to laugh, or cry, or both. But instead, she turned off her phone, closed the shop for the day, and walked. When she reached the garage, she didn't knock. James was under a hood, sleeves rolled up, grease smudged across his forearm. He looked up the moment he heard the door open. His eyes softened when he saw her, but her face didn't match his hope. She held the printed article out, her hand steady. James didn't need to read it. You saw it, he said quietly. Nancy nodded once. I did. He wiped his hands on a rag, tossed it aside and stepped closer. Nancy, I wanted to tell you. But you didn't. He exhaled. It never felt like the right time. I didn't want, to change how I saw you, she cut in. He didn't answer, which, somehow, was worse. Nancy's voice was calm, but firm. You said you showed up for me. You told me this felt real. but you didn't even show me who you were." "I wasn't hiding because I was ashamed," James said quickly. I liked being seen for something other than a last name or a company logo. I liked that Rosie didn't care how much money I had. I liked that you," he paused, "that you treated me like I was just enough." Nancy blinked, eyes glistening now. "But you weren't honest, and that's what hurts more than anything your net worth could ever say." James stepped forward instinctively, but she took a small step back. Behind her, Rosie stood quietly in the doorway, still wearing her pink dress from earlier that morning. Her tiny fingers clutched the edge of the frame. She looked from Nancy to James, confusion wrinkling her small brow. "Is he not my team anymore?" she asked softly. The question hit James like a punch to the ribs. He crouched down, eyes meeting Rosie's. "I want to be," he said, voice tight. "I still want to be." But Rosie didn't smile. She simply walked toward Nancy and took her hand. Nancy didn't speak again. She didn't yell. She didn't ask him to explain. She just left. James stood alone in the garage, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the weight of truth sitting heavier on his shoulders than any car he'd ever lifted. It wasn't the exposure that gutted him, not the loss of control, not even the article. It was knowing that for the first time in his life, he had built something that mattered, not a company, not a brand, but a connection, and he had shattered it by not trusting her with the truth. He didn't lose Nancy because he wasn't good enough. He lost her because he hadn't believed she would stay if she knew the whole story. And now, he had to learn what it felt like to fix something that couldn't be repaired with tools. James didn't call. He didn't text. But he did something else. He built. Every Saturday morning before the garage officially opened, he rolled up the doors early, not for clients, not for profit, but for a different kind of fix. He called it Garage for Kids. No press releases, no logos, no CEO speeches. Just a dusty corner of his garage cleared out, tools laid across a long table, small workbenches brought in, and extra gloves in all sizes, even the tiniest ones. Word spread slowly, quietly, mostly through tired parents, curious teens, and the occasional school counselor who heard from a student that some guy teaches us to fix things on Saturdays. James never said his name, never wore anything with the Cole Automotive logo. He was just James the mechanic, sleeves rolled up, patience steady, grease under his nails, and hope tucked in the way he knelt to tie a kid's shoelace or stayed late to show how a carburetor breathes. He didn't do it to win Nancy back. He did it because she had reminded him why real things mattered. That's how it happened. Nancy heard about it from a customer at the flower shop, an older woman with a soft voice who came in every week for white daisies. She mentioned her grandson, learning how to change oil from a quiet man who never asks for anything in return. Nancy didn't ask questions, just listened. And that Saturday afternoon, she showed up. Rosie wore her pink dress, the one she always wore on important days. Her hair was in pigtails, and her little hands clutched a box of donuts, her own idea. The garage was alive with noise, tools clinking, laughter bouncing off the walls, the occasional whoops when something dropped. James didn't notice them at first. He was showing a boy how to balance a tire, crouched low beside the wheel. Then he heard it. "I wore pink today, just in case you miss our team." Rosie's voice rang out clear, cutting through everything. James turned. Rosie ran to him before he could say a word, throwing her arms around his waist. He froze for half a second, then knelt, returning her hug without hesitation. She smelled like strawberry shampoo and powdered sugar. He looked up. Nancy was standing a few feet away. Her arms weren't crossed. Her shoulders weren't tense. She was just watching. Their eyes met. She stepped forward, her voice soft, but unwavering. "You didn't ask me to come." James stood slowly, waiting. She continued. but you made a place I couldn't ignore." For a long moment, neither spoke. There was nothing grand, no apology monologue, no sweeping gestures. Just the scent of motor oil, the sound of kids learning, and the space between them slowly closing, not with promises, but with proof. James bent down again, brushing Rosie's bangs aside gently. "I missed our team every day," he said. Rosie grinned. "Then you should have come to lunch. We had pancakes." He laughed, quiet, real. Nancy took a small step closer. This time, he didn't step back. She didn't say, "I forgive you." She didn't need to. Because some people say it not with words, but by showing up. And this was her way of staying. 1 year later, what once had been two separate lives became something neither of them had planned, but both had chosen. Where the alley once divided the auto garage from the flower shop, now stood a garden courtyard, small but thriving. Stone pathways wound through beds of lavender, daisies, and climbing roses, planted by hands that had once only known grease and soil. A long wooden bench stretched under a flowering trellis, worn smooth by stories shared, lunches eaten, and secrets kept. In the mornings, children came in giggling waves, eager to learn how to patch a tire or wire a headlamp from James. In the afternoons, women practiced floral arrangements with Nancy, laughter blooming louder than the blossoms themselves. On weekends, older folks brought their books, their memories, and their time, offering stories in exchange for a seat and a cup of tea. There were no banners, no brands, just a hand-painted sign above the archway that read, "For those who asked for one day and found a place to stay." Inside the main hallway, there hung a drawing, crayon, and marker, proudly signed in the corner by Rosie M., age 6. It showed 3 stick figures. One had dark hair and a wrench. One had long yellow hair and a bouquet. The smallest wore a pink dress, her smile taking up half her face. Above them fluttered a little flag that read, "Team Us." Nancy found James in the garden just before sunset, adjusting the trellis with his usual quiet focus. His shirt was half-buttoned, sleeves rolled up, a smudge of dirt on his jaw. He looked up as she approached, wiping his hands on a towel. She didn't say anything, just handed him a small brown box, wrapped simply with twine. He raised an eyebrow. "Open it," she said. Inside lay a bracelet, a simple pink silicone band, almost identical to the one Rosie always wore. Only this one had 4 words etched into it. There was nothing grand, no apology monologue, no sweeping gestures. Just the scent of motor oil, the sound of kids learning, and the space between them slowly closing, not with promises, but with proof. James bent down again, brushing Rosie's bangs aside gently. "I missed our team every day," he said. Rosie grinned. "Then you should have come to lunch. We had pancakes." He laughed, quiet, real. Nancy took a small step closer. This time, he didn't step back. She didn't say, "I forgive you." She didn't need to. Because some people say it not with words, but by showing up. And this was her way of staying. 1 year later, what once had been 2 separate lives became something neither of them had planned, but both had chosen. Where the alley once divided the auto garage from the flower shop, now stood a garden courtyard, small but thriving. Stone pathways wound through beds of lavender, daisies, and climbing roses, planted by hands that had once only known grease and soil. A long wooden bench stretched under a flowering trellis, worn smooth by stories shared, lunches eaten, and secrets kept. In the mornings, children came in giggling waves, eager to learn how to patch a tire or wire a headlamp from James. In the afternoons, women practiced floral arrangements with Nancy, laughter blooming louder than the blossoms themselves. On weekends, older folks brought their books, their memories, and their time, offering stories in exchange for a seat and a cup of tea. There were no banners, no brands, just a hand-painted sign above the archway that read, "For those who asked for one day and found a place to stay." Inside the main hallway, there hung a drawing, crayon, and marker, proudly signed in the corner by Rosie M., age 6. It showed 3 stick figures. One had dark hair and a wrench. One had long yellow hair and a bouquet. The smallest wore a pink dress, her smile taking up half her face. Above them fluttered a little flag that read, "Team Us." Nancy found James in the garden just before sunset, adjusting the trellis with his usual quiet focus. His shirt was half-buttoned, sleeves rolled up, a smudge of dirt on his jaw. He looked up as she approached, wiping his hands on a towel. She didn't say anything, just handed him a small brown box, wrapped simply with twine. He raised an eyebrow. "Open it," she said. Inside lay a bracelet, a simple pink silicone band, almost identical to the one Rosie always wore. Only this one had 4 words etched into it. "Team Us, no end date." James stared at it for a long second, then smiled. That rare, slow smile that meant more than thank you ever could. He slipped it on. Nancy crossed her arms, tilting her head. "Still want to be my fake boyfriend for a day?" James chuckled. "No, just the real one, for every day after." Nancy reached for his hand. "Good, because Rosie already added you to her emergency contact list." He laughed, this time, fully, freely. "Well then, I guess I better stick around." They sat down on the bench, side by side, as twilight settled around them. Rosie was somewhere inside, helping one of the older women organize the books by prettiness, which mostly meant stacking anything pink together. For a moment, neither spoke. The garden was quiet, except for the soft hum of wind chimes and the low murmur of someone reading aloud nearby. Nancy leaned her head gently against James's shoulder. This wasn't part